Hi! Welcome to the first segment in this two-part episode about music and the plague, focusing on Claudio Monteverdi's Gloria for seven voices, a piece that was at least very likely written to celebrate the end of the Great Plague of Milan in 1631. The plague is something that's always been pretty fascinating for me, but for some reason in the past little more than a year or so, it's become even more so. Maybe some of you feel the same way. In this first part, I'll talk about the oddly personal story of Monteverdi's confrontation with the plague, when it was brought to his home of Venice by one of his very best friends. Then in part two, we'll take a close look at this piece and see how it can be interpreted as a literal musical depiction of the experience of a plague outbreak. It should give us a lot to talk about, so be sure to stick around. I'm Peter, and this is We Need to Talk About Music. In the late spring of 1630, a diplomatic delegation crept through the Po River Valley in northern Italy on their way to the Republic of Venice. They were on a desperate mission to beg for Venetian support for the city of Mantua, which was being held under siege by the armies of Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II, who was attempting to take political advantage of the heirless death of the Duke of Mantua, Vincenzo II of Gonzaga. Despite these grave circumstances, for the leader of this haggard group, a minor noble, poet, and musician named Alessandro Striggio, the mission had a silver lining. It would mean an opportunity to reconnect with his old friend and collaborator, former court musician of Mantua and current maestro di cappella of the Church of San Marco in Venice, Claudio Monteverdi. Monteverdi, who was well into his 60s by this point, had long before sealed his reputation as the most revolutionary musician of his generation. From a young age, he was known for writing music that was gutsier, sexier, and especially more dramatic than anything that had come before. In sketches of music history, he's often given near single-handed credit for bringing an end to the Renaissance era and starting the Baroque. And while this is, of course, an exaggeration, it's not quite as out of line as you might think. He first made a name for himself in the late 16th century as a composer of madrigals, musical settings of elite, usually secular poetry that were all the rage among upper-class Italians at the time. Like many others of his generation, though, he soon became disillusioned with the headiness and abstraction of the madrigal, and he started to look for ways to make his music less cerebral and more expressive. He became interested in monody, which was a trend of writing music just for a single voice and accompaniment, rather than for a group of independent voices. He started to choose poetry that told stories and depicted intense emotions over the more introspective verse that was typical for madrigals. And maybe most importantly, he started to selectively disregard some of the old compositional norms that had preserved that famously smooth texture that you find in music from the Renaissance. When he was publicly called out for this by a music theorist named Giovanni Artusi, Monteverdi simply argued that while the old rules were great for the old style, what he called the first practice, he was developing something different, a second practice that prioritized depicting emotions, in which theoretically any musical gesture could be allowable if it's justified by the emotion being depicted. A few years later, he took these preoccupations to their logical conclusion in the work that he's probably best remembered for today, L'Orfeo. This so-called fable in music was a fully staged musical retelling of the myth of Orpheus, featuring talky, fast-paced music called recitative, as well as more song-like arias. In other words, it was something very much like an opera. It wasn't the first opera-like thing to be created. Musical drama of one kind or another has been around for thousands of years, and it was experiencing a particular resurgence in the years leading up to L'Orfeo. There were even two other versions of the same story, both called Euridice after the female protagonist, released in the previous 10 years. But it was L'Orfeo that made and continues to make the biggest impression, and it was ultimately the work that set the template for the genre of opera going forward. Monteverdi's writing partner for this project the person who wrote the words that he set to music, was none other than Alessandro Striggio. Striggio, the son of one of the most innovative musicians of the previous generation, had been one of Monteverdi's chief philosophical allies during his years in Mantua, and after Monteverdi moved to Venice in 1613, the two had stayed in extremely close contact. A rare opportunity to see one another in person must have been something for both of them to look forward to, but sadly there was to be no joy in this reunion. At some point in their journey, Striggio's delegation probably crossed the path that Ferdinand's army had taken on its way to Mantua, and they must have picked up a few stray fleas that had been left along the way. Within a few days of their arrival, Striggio died from bubonic plague, the first recorded death in an outbreak that would ultimately claim almost a third of the Venetian population. This outbreak, known as the Great Plague of Milan because that's where it first really got going, killed about 1 million people in northern and central Italy between 1629 and 1631. It was one of the last major events in a pandemic of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes the 3 varieties of plague, pneumonic, septicemic, and the most common, bubonic, that lasted more than 300 years, from the Black Death, which began in the 1330s and arrived in Europe in 1347, until at least the Great Plague of London in 1665 and 1666. Throughout this period, no one really had any clue what plague was or how it was being spread. The idea of disease-spreading germs had been suggested by this point, mostly by scholars from the Islamic world, but it wouldn't be widely accepted in Europe for another 300 years or so. Speculation as to the cause ranged from imbalances of bodily fluids to anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, something you might hope we would have moved past by now. In 16th and 17th century Venice, the most commonly cited culprit was bad air, a relatively vague concept, but something that Venetians, who threw their garbage and sewage into shallow, often inadequately ventilated canals, certainly knew a thing or two about. Whatever they thought was causing the plague, the people of Venice do seem to have understood that, as a busy port city with a large population packed onto a few small islands, they were especially susceptible to it. They had been among the first to witness the devastation of the Black Death, and in the centuries since, they had experienced an outbreak large enough to kill a substantial portion of their population about once every generation. In response to this horrifying routine, the Venetian government initiated some astonishingly forward-thinking health regulations. Ships arriving in the Venetian lagoon during times of epidemic were required to wait 40 days, or 40 giorni, to come ashore, the origin of our term quarantine. Also, 2 islands, both about 3 kilometers away from the main part of the city, were set aside to house people who had been exposed. The Lazzaretto Nuovo, for people who were still healthy, and the Lazzaretto Vecchio, for those who were sick and likely to die. These islands, particularly the latter, were often compared to hell or purgatory, and it surely must have been a horrific ordeal for people who had been sent to them. But at the same time, it's positively humanitarian compared to some other European cities, where the houses of plague sufferers, including the still healthy people who lived there, were often simply nailed shut. There was also a more mystical side to Venetian plague prevention. In 1485, a group of merchants disguised themselves as pilgrims and traveled to southern France to literally steal the remains of San Rocco, or Saint Roch, a patron saint of plague sufferers and dog lovers, in hopes that having his remains in Venice would help protect the city. Nearly 100 years later, after disastrously allowing an epidemic to get out of hand due to pressure from wealthy merchants, something we would know nothing about today, the Venetian government decided to make a literal contract with Jesus, offering to build a church and to create a new holiday in exchange for ending the devastation. The result of this arrangement was the construction of architect Andrea Palladio's Chiesa del Redentore, the Church of the Redeemer, which can be seen across the water from the Piazza San Marco. Every year, on the Feast of the Redeemer, which is still celebrated on the 3rd Sunday of July, thousands of Venetians take part in the ritual of Andata, the journey there, which consists of walking across the wide Giudecca Canal on a temporary bridge built across the decks of hundreds of boats. When the plague returned to Venice in 1630, the government decided to take a similar approach, and they struck up an almost identical contract, this time with the Virgin Mary. The outbreak turned out to be even worse than the last one, but they still honored their side of the bargain. When the plague was finally declared over in the fall of 1631, a special ceremony of Thanksgiving was scheduled for November 21st, a date that's still commemorated with the crossing of another, considerably shorter temporary bridge. The ceremony consisted of a special mass in San Marco, followed by a trip across the Rialto Canal to lay the cornerstone for what would become the Chiesa della Santa Maria della Salute, a towering white Baroque church that's still one of the most striking features of the Venetian skyline. We know from contemporary accounts that Monteverdi was there at that ceremony leading the music. And, very unusually for an event like this, we actually have a pretty good idea of what some of that music might have been. Now, to be clear, this is not 100% certain. Basically, what we know is that some people who were there mentioned that two parts of the Mass, the Gloria and the Credo, were extra special and included some special instruments, most likely trombones. As it happens, a big collection of music that Monteverdi published 10 years later contains a special Gloria, and some, but not all parts of the Credo, with a note saying that trombones may be optionally included, although no music for the trombones is provided. You may or may not find this to be compelling evidence. Trombones were actually fairly common in Venetian church music, and we know from his letters that Monteverdi wrote a whole lot more music for San Marco than he ever published. So who's to say that his music from this particular event didn't get lost in the shuffle somewhere? As a fully responsible historian, I have to admit that there's far from enough evidence to say for sure. But as a non-fully responsible music lover, I am personally very convinced that at least the Gloria for seven voices, the piece I'll be focusing on, was in fact performed on that day. In part 2, I'll talk a little bit about why I think so, and then we'll spend some time looking at what is definitely an absolutely fantastic piece of music, whatever else it might be. It should be interesting, so be sure to tune in. For the meantime, stay healthy and happy, and don't forget to listen to some music now and then.